My story begins as the overlooked child. Not the kind you see storming out in a dramatic rebellion, but the one quietly tucked into the background, nearly invisible to his own family. Growing up, I was always the afterthought, the forgotten son. I didn't make waves, didn't seek attention, and perhaps because of that, I was easy to ignore. My parents had a clear favorite, my younger sister, S. She was their pride and joy, the golden child. Every achievement S made, no matter how small, was celebrated as if she'd won an Olympic medal. Her mistakes? Excuses were ready and waiting to soften any blow. She had a built-in safety net, a web of protection and support that I, on the other hand, had never experienced. To my parents, I was the independent one, the kid who never needed anything, or so they convinced themselves. For years, I let this dynamic slide, staying out of their way and taking care of myself. They'd leave me alone, and I'd do the same. It was a quiet acceptance until the day I needed them most. 5 years ago, at 28, I fell seriously ill. It wasn't just a passing sickness. It was a diagnosis that required surgery, treatments, and a list of medications I could barely pronounce. I didn't have health insurance, and the cost was staggering. I was working a decent job, but it didn't offer coverage, and my savings were a mere drop in the bucket compared to the medical bills that kept piling up. I was drowning in financial worry and facing the terrifying prospect of not being able to afford life-saving treatment. Desperate and ashamed, I went to my parents. It was a humbling moment, one I'll never forget. I sat down with them, laying everything out, explaining my situation, and asking if they could help me in any way. I expected concern, empathy, maybe even an offer to contribute something, anything, towards my medical bills. Instead, they exchanged a quick glance, as if they had already anticipated this conversation. My father sat silently, arms crossed, while my mother's face was an unreadable mask. After a few moments, my dad finally broke the silence. "We can't help you with that," he said, his tone as final as a slammed door. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. "What do you mean you can't help?" "This is life or death," I stammered, trying to process his response. But my mother, calm as ever, clarified the situation. "We've already committed our savings to S's wedding," she said, her voice almost soothing, as if I should understand perfectly. "We wanted to be perfect for her." I felt my heart sink, a knot forming in my throat. "You're telling me you can't help with my medical bills because you're paying for a wedding?" My voice cracked as I asked the question. My dad looked unbothered, even impatient. "You're strong," he said, almost dismissively. "You'll manage. You always do." It was in that moment I realized that, to them, S's wedding was more important than my life. My parents were willing to prioritize a party over their son's health and well-being. I don't even remember leaving their house that day. The shock and hurt blurred everything. All I felt was the burn of betrayal and the crushing weight of being utterly alone. Months passed. I didn't speak to them. I couldn't bring myself to. Every ounce of my energy went into surviving. I picked up side gigs, from tutoring to driving for Uber, and took on odd jobs just to scrape together enough for the surgery. My credit cards were maxed out, and I eventually had to take out a personal loan. It was a grueling time, but I got through it alone. And while I was fighting to stay alive, my sister had her fairy tale wedding, complete with a designer dress, flowers, and a big, lavish venue. They didn't even invite me. Not that I would have gone. I was still recovering from surgery as they celebrated. Fast forward a few years, and the tables turned. Through mutual friends, I heard that my parents had made some terrible financial decisions. They'd invested a substantial sum in a business deal that went south, and it wiped out most of their savings. I didn't pay it much mind. After what they'd done, their financial troubles were none of my concern. Then one day, my mother called me out of the blue. The desperation in her voice was evident. "We need your help," she said, skipping any pleasantries. I let her words hang there, caught off guard by the sheer audacity. "Help," I repeated, more in disbelief than anything else. She took a shaky breath before continuing. Your father and we've lost a lot of money. The business deal we invested in went bad, and we're on the verge of losing the house. We need money, she explained, her voice cracking. It was surreal. The same parents who had dismissed my own crisis, who had left me to fend for myself while they funded S's wedding, were now turning to me for a financial lifeline. I clenched my fists, feeling a rush of anger and hurt. Let me get this straight. When I was drowning in medical bills, you couldn't help me because you were paying for a wedding. But now you expect me to bail you out because you made a bad investment. My voice shook with fury. She didn't even deny it. That was a different situation, she murmured, sounding almost defeated. I couldn't hold back my rage. Different situation? You left me to fend for myself when I needed you the most. You chose her wedding over my life. And now you want me to save you from your own mistakes. There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. We had to make choices. The irony was bitter. Choices. They made their choice when they left me to struggle alone, prioritizing a party over their son's well-being. And now, they were reaping the consequences of those choices. I ended the call with no intention of helping them. My parents had made it clear where I stood in their lives, and I had finally come to terms with it. They had chosen their golden child. They had made their choices, and so had I. Grew up in a household where my parents doted on my younger sister, S, and she was their undeniable favorite. Her achievements were celebrated as if she conquered the world, while her mistakes were met with sympathy and quick explanations. As for me, my achievements barely warranted a nod, and my struggles were overlooked. I was the forgotten son, quietly expected to fend for myself. I accepted it, thinking that at least I had my independence and wouldn't have to depend on them. But everything changed when I got seriously ill at 28. I wasn't facing a simple health scare. I was staring down a complex, life-threatening condition that required extensive medical treatment, surgeries, and medications. I was employed, but my job didn't provide insurance, and the medical bills began piling up faster than I could manage. After exhausting all my resources, I turned to my parents, desperate for support. Sitting with them, I laid out my situation, the details of my illness, the costs, my fears, and my inability to pay. I was expecting empathy, perhaps even some financial help. Instead, I was met with silence. My father sat, arms crossed, offering nothing but a blank stare, while my mother listened with a calm expression that seemed detached. When I finished, they exchanged a look, and my father spoke. We can't help you with that. I was taken aback, struggling to comprehend. What do you mean you can't help? I asked, my voice already shaky with disbelief. We've already committed our savings to S's wedding, he explained. It's a big event. We're doing it right. My mother added, we want it to be perfect for her. You understand, don't you? Understanding was the last thing I felt. They were choosing my sister's wedding over my survival, and the message was clear. I wasn't worth the sacrifice. I left that day devastated, realizing just how alone I was. They had made their choice, and I had no one but myself to rely on. I took on every side job I could find, tutoring, driving for Uber, and picking up any odd job that paid. I maxed out credit cards, took on loans, and worked day and night to scrape together enough for my medical needs. Somehow, I managed to survive, pushing through surgeries and treatments with no support from my family. Meanwhile, my parents threw us the wedding of her dreams. A luxurious venue, designer dress, flowers, the works. I wasn't even invited, but I was too wrapped up in my recovery to care. It stung, of course, to know they were toasting her happiness while I was fighting to stay alive. But I had become used to fighting alone. Years passed. I managed to rebuild, finding success on my own terms, all while maintaining a cold distance from my parents. They had made their choice, and I made mine, to move on without them. But fate had its twists. My parents made some bad investments and lost most of their savings in a failed business venture. I heard about their situation through mutual friends, but didn't feel much sympathy. They had chosen their path, and I saw no reason to be concerned with their misfortune. One day, out of nowhere, my mother called. Her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable in its vulnerability. She skipped any pleasantries and went straight to the point. "We need your help," she said. I hesitated, trying to process the audacity of the request. "Help? With what?" After a pause, she explained, "Your father and we lost a lot in a business deal. We might lose the house if we can't come up with the money." The irony was painful. After refusing to help me in my darkest hour, they were now asking me to rescue them from their own mistakes. "So, let me get this straight," I said, voice laced with anger. "You couldn't help me when I needed life-saving treatment, but you expect me to bail you out now." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of their betrayal. "That was different," my mother replied, almost dismissively. "S's wedding was important." Her words felt like a slap. "A wedding?" I said, my voice rising. "You're telling me you chose a party over my life, and now you expect me to help you?" My father took the phone then, his tone cold and demanding. "We did what we thought was best. Family helps family. It's time for you to do your part." I laughed bitterly. "Family helps family? That's convenient coming from you. When I was struggling to survive, you turned your back on me. And now, you want to preach about family." He tried to argue, calling me petty and claiming that grudges weren't helpful. But I was done. I told them in no uncertain terms that they had made their bed, and now they could lie in it. They couldn't call me family only when it suited them. I hung up, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and relief. A few days later, S reached out. We hadn't spoken since her wedding, and I could already guess her agenda. Her tone was sharp as she went straight to the point. "They're going to lose the house. Don't you care at all?" I replied with a sigh, "Not my problem, S. They made their choices." "You're being selfish," she snapped. "They helped you plenty growing up." I laughed coldly. "Did they? Because from where I'm standing, they did everything for you and nothing for me. They left me to drown in debt, while they threw you a 5-star wedding." She didn't argue on that point. Instead, she played the family card, claiming they were our parents and we owed them something. "No, S," I replied firmly. "I don't owe them anything. And from the sound of it, neither do you, since you're not exactly offering up your own money. I have a family to take care of," she shot back defensively. "Yeah, and I have a life to live," I said, my voice flat. "I'm not putting myself in financial ruin to fix their mess." The silence on the other end was tense. I could almost feel her frustration as she searched for a way to guilt me. Then, with a venomous edge, she said, "You know, after everything they did for you, I didn't expect you to be so heartless. You're just like Dad always said, cold, selfish, only thinking about yourself. Maybe that's why they never counted on you for anything." Her words stung, a cruel reminder of years of dismissal. But I was no longer that same overlooked kid desperate for their approval. I was stronger, and I knew I deserved better. Calmly, I replied, "You done?" She let out a frustrated breath. "I don't know how you live with yourself." "I live just fine, S," I replied, my tone unyielding. "I live knowing I survived without them. And without you." The call had started like so many others between us, with tension simmering just beneath the surface. She accused me, as always, of being selfish. She couldn't understand why I was being so blunt, why I was refusing to take responsibility for our parents' mess this time. My sister had always been their golden child, the one who could do no wrong, thanks to our parents constantly propping her up. Growing up, I'd often felt overshadowed by her, the favorite, while I was left to handle my struggles alone. She had grown so accustomed to being their prized child that she assumed I'd be there to take the blame, to pick up the pieces when things went wrong. "They chose you," I told her, my voice calm. They always chose you. So, go help them. You're their favorite, after all. Her response was quick and sharp, words spat out like venom. You're unbelievable. They're going to lose everything, and you'll be responsible for it. No, I replied firmly. They're responsible for it. They're grown adults, and they can deal with it themselves. With that, she hung up, leaving me staring at my phone, pulse racing. Yet again, I felt the weight of guilt and the familiar pressure of expectations. My family's belief that I should somehow be the one to fix their problems, as if it were my duty. But I wasn't falling for it this time. Not again. I refused to keep sacrificing my well-being for a family that never reciprocated. In the weeks that followed, my parents didn't reach out. My sister didn't either. Through mutual friends, I heard that my parents had sold their house and were now living in a cramped apartment, barely managing to get by. As it turned out, my sister wasn't helping them either. Her husband had apparently refused to throw their savings into what he called a black hole. It was ironic to see that when faced with their own hardships, my family, who'd expected me to rescue them, had nowhere to turn. I should have felt something, regret, maybe even sadness, but instead, I felt a sense of freedom. For the first time in my life, I was no longer tied down by their expectations and demands. I had always been the good son, the one who didn't make waves, who quietly took care of things on his own, but doing so had nearly crushed me. Now, I was finally choosing myself, and it felt good. Months passed, and I didn't hear from them. Then one day, I received a letter from their lawyer. They were threatening to cut me out of their will if I didn't step in and help them financially. The absurdity of it all made me laugh out loud. I had long since stopped expecting anything from them, and yet here they were, trying to use their will as some form of leverage, as if that would compel me to step in and save them. Curious, I called the lawyer to confirm. So, if I don't give them money now, they'll write me out of the will? I asked. Yes, the lawyer replied, sounding slightly uncomfortable. That's what they've instructed. Well, tell them to go ahead, I said, a smile spreading across my face. I don't need anything from them. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the lawyer clearly taken aback. Are you certain? More than certain, I replied. They can do whatever they want with their money. I don't want a cent of it. And that was it. I was done, officially closing the door on that chapter of my life with no lingering regrets or second thoughts. I moved forward, focused on building a life that was mine. I started dating again, reconnected with old friends, and threw myself into my work. For the first time, I wasn't weighed down by their expectations or their constant favoritism toward my sister. I felt lighter than I ever had. My sister never reached out again, not even when our parents' situation worsened, which I only heard about through acquaintances. But it didn't surprise me. She had always known how to disappear when things got tough. She didn't care about cleaning up their mess any more than I did. Through all of this, I came to realize something important. Family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when it matters, who supports you when you need it most. And they hadn't been there for me. So, I didn't owe them anything in return. Do I feel bad about what happened to them? Maybe a little, but not enough to regret my decision. You can't fix people who don't want to be fixed. You can't save people who would let you drown if it meant they could save themselves. And finally, after all these years, I'm just glad I learned that before it was too late.